When we start with the urinary system, we want to realize that the urinary system covers the kidneys. We're taking a look at the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. The urinary system helps to maintain homeostasis by managing volume, we're talking about water here, and composition of fluid reservoirs, primarily blood. When we look at the urinary system, we see the structures that sit in the abdominal cavity. All right, so once again, these include the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra, right? Functions of the urinary system are going to primarily include regulation, sodium, potassium, chloride. It's also going to help us to regulate our pH, so those hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. It's going to regulate the water volume of the blood. It's also going to work to regulate blood pressure, blood osmolarity, hormones, so specific hormones that are specific to the kidney. We're going to take a look at how the body excretes metabolic waste. So we talked about nitrogenous waste in the last unit. We're also going to be looking at drugs and toxins and what the body does with those things, as well as, it reabsorbs, it secretes, has a couple different activities within the kidney. We're going to talk about all of them. So we're also going to see that the kidney is responsible for regulating glucose levels, right? So when we're looking at this anatomy here, what we're looking at is a cross section of the kidneys. And a cross section, this cross section includes the entire abdominal cavity. What we see is that when we look at the layers here, so here we see the kidneys, and we see that the kidneys are situated in a fat capsule here, and also the renal capsule, right? We say that the kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they are behind the peritoneum, which is the serous membrane of the abdominal cavity. It's partially protected by the lower ribs, so mainly the 12th rib and a little bit the 11th rib, so the sets 11 and 12. Here we're looking at a different section. So we're looking at a sagittal, mid-sagittal section of the kidney. We specifically see that it is sitting in the fat capsule there. All right, so that is very important for the kidney. Hang on for 1 second. Okay, so as we said, we say that the kidney is sitting in a fat capsule here. So what I want to do at this point is, now that we've talked a little bit about where the kidneys are, what surrounds them, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and draw the kidney with you. It does eventually go. I'm not sure what happens here with my, it gives me a couple tries. All right, and here we go. One more. All right. Okay, can everybody see my screen here?
Yes.
So I apologize, my pen is freezing a little bit. I've ordered a new one, but it's okay. If you see my pen stop, it'll come back on track. All right, so the very first thing that I want you to do here is I want you to just draw a bean and draw a nice fat bean shape. And I'm going to do this nice and slow with you. Right. And then what I want you to do is I want you to draw pyramids like this. Right? And this does not have to be perfect. You want to draw the apex pointing towards the hilum here. So this is the hilum, just like we saw in the lungs. To this section here. So the apex is the bottom. Right? Keep going. We're going to draw 6 to 8 of these pyramids. Okay, how'd everybody do?
Okay.
Okay. All right, now what I want you to do is I want you to draw a half circle around that apex. So just around that bottom part there. Right. And once you've done this, I want you to put 2 lines on the sides of each one. And don't worry that they're so close together. We're still going to add those in. Just kind of put those together like that. We're going to bring it all together like this. And it's going to leave the hilum there. And it's going to enter to the outside of the body, or outside of the kidney. It's going to leave the hilum and work into the abdominal cavity there. I guess really it's the pelvic cavity as we look at the lower part. So once you have that nice long tube, we're going to make just half of one on the opposite side. Oops. Not sure what happened there. Right? And you're just going to bring that together. How'd everybody do so far?
Okay.
Okay. Does anybody need another minute? No? Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we are going to label this. All right. So this here, this outer part, this is called the cortex of the kidney. And we're going to say, I'm going to put in a name. I'm going to say that most nephrons are here. So most nephrons. And nephrons are, we're going to say, the functional units of the kidney. So these are the functional units of the kidney. All right. All right. So that being said, the cortex is this part here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to put in some lines so that we know that this is the cortex. All right. Now, the pyramids that we drew in, the pyramids are the next part here. And the pyramids are called the medullary pyramids. So they're called the medullary pyramids. And they, so we want to make a note, these pyramids are in the medulla of the kidney. All right. So hence the name, medullary pyramids. All right, so these are all medullary pyramids. And this part here, this intersection is the medulla. All right. So the name applies. Sometimes we say renal pyramids. Okay. So the very next thing that we want to identify is this structure here. So these smaller structures, all right? And these are called the minor calyx, right? And just above this here, this part here, we have the papilla. All right. So we have the minor calyx and we have the papilla there. Now, just below the minor calyx, we have the major calyx. And that's this section here. All right. So this section just below, this is all major calyx. So we have the minor and we have the major calyx. The major calyx is then going to meet this part here, all right? And this part here, we're going to put RP over here. This is the renal pelvis. And then what's going to happen?
Which part was the renal pelvis? Sorry,
So,
I was writing. I wasn't looking at the screen.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
This middle section here is the renal.
Okay.
There you go. All right. So the renal pelvis is then going to flow into the ureter. So this is the ureter. Okay. So the ureter is then going to flow into the bladder. So we say this is the urinary bladder. And the bladder will flow into the urethra. All right. So this is this part here, as this nice long tube there at the bottom. All right. Up above the kidney, what we see is we see the adrenal gland. So we want to just draw a triangular structure above there. So up here, we see the adrenal gland. All right. And the adrenal gland has both the cortex and the medulla. So it has a cortex and it has the medulla. All right. Okay. So this being said, one last structure here that we have is we have our blood and we have two vessels. So we have I'm going to write renal artery here, RA, renal artery enters into the kidney. And then we have the renal vein leaving the kidney. All right. So this one here, this is the renal vein. And you can feel free to take a picture if you like. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do just a little bit of erasing over here. All right, just on the side. I won't erase the whole thing just yet. All right, just to make some room. So when we talk about the kidney, we talk about the kidney getting rid of waste. And when we think about it, we usually think about that waste leaving the body through urine. So think about urine for a second. Urine is made through a 3-step process, all right? So urine is made through 3 steps, right? We need to have filtration. We need to have reabsorption. And we need to have secretion. All right. So filtration, reabsorption, and secretion are the 3 steps that we need to see in the kidney in order to form urine. So there's a specific place where that occurs. All right. And that's in the nephron. So it's between the nephron and the blood. So the nephron really is the functional unit of the kidney. The end of the nephron is called the collecting duct. We're going to talk about the nephron in just a minute. But the end of the nephron is called the collecting duct. And it looks like this. All right. And what we're going to see is that these collecting ducts, what they do is they flow through these renal pyramids like this. So one thing that we want to understand right now is that urine leaves the collecting duct. So that is a final product, and it's gone through these steps to create this product. All right. So from the collecting duct, this urine will travel through the medullary pyramids. We always got to have a flow chart. From the medullary pyramids to the renal papilla. From the renal papilla, it'll flow into the minor calyx. From the minor calyx to the major calyx. And from the major calyx into the renal pelvis. And from the renal pelvis into the ureter to the urinary bladder, and then into the urethra, where it will leave the body. So we call this flow urine flow. Urine flow through the kidney, all right? So as we said, it leaves this collecting duct. It enters into the renal pelvis here. to the minor calyx, all right, on through to the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, into the ureters, and from the ureter, it will enter into the urinary bladder. All right. So we'll talk about muscle and how it leaves through the urethra a little bit later, just learning the anatomy right now. All right. So remember what this was here. So this was the collecting duct. All right. And that was the collecting duct from the nephron. Okay. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to move on to the next step, and I want to talk about that nephron.
Miss Marsh, really quick. When you do the urine flow, you have the medullary pyramids,
That's
the renal papilla. Did you say, where does the collecting duct go in there? At the very beginning?
so the collecting duct is going to go through these medullary pyramids.
But
And-
does it go on this flow chart?
Yes. So the collecting duct, here's your collecting duct. I see what
So
you're
it'd
at.
be
Yes,
collecting duct and then the medullary?
that's right. So you want to make
Okay.
urine leaves the collecting duct. So you want to say urine leaves the collecting duct and enters into the medullary pyramid.
And the blood is sent
So
first up.
we're not talking about blood yet. We'll get there in just a minute. You're actually going to have 3 flow charts for this unit. So if you can draw this out and you can really think about what's happening here, you should be okay.
You take a picture of that. You leave it.
Yep.
Nookie.
Okay. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear this. All right. And I just want to do it with you one more time to make a point. So if you could flip your page. All right. And this time I'm not going to label it. I'm just going to ask you what the parts are. All right. So we're going to make it a little bit smaller this time, or you can make it nice and big at home if you want. Remember, it does not have to be perfect. So you want to have 6 to 8 of the pyramids. You want to draw the papilla in and the minor calyx. All right. So then you're making the major calyx there. So here's your major calyx. And you're going to just leave through the hilum there. All right. Draw the ureter and the bladder. Okay. So what was this part here? So let's go ahead and label this number 1. What was that?
Cortex?
So that was the cortex. All right. And number 2, what's number 2?
Medulla.
All right. So you almost got it. So the
Medullary
pyramid.
there you go, medullary pyramids. And they're called the medullary pyramids because they're in the medulla. All right. So next one, number 3, this was the
Minor calyx.
good. Calyx. And number 4,
Major?
good. So number 4 is the what?
Major
Major.
calyx.
Good. The major calyx. Let's try to hear from everybody. All right. So number 5, what is this part here? So number 5,
Renal pelvis.
the renal pelvis. All right. And number 6,
Ureter.
very good. All right. And number 7,
The bladder.
good. Urinary bladder. All right. And number 8,
Urethra. Urethra.
very good. So we have the urethra. All right. So we have all the parts of the kidney, and we want to understand that the flow. So remember what we said here. We said that we have most nephrons are located here. All right. And before we can understand the nephron, what we have to understand is blood flow. So let's go on to that next step. So remember what we said in our last one. We said that blood enters the kidney through the renal artery here, all right? And blood leaves the kidney through the renal vein, right? So this is the renal artery and the renal vein. Remember that this renal artery is coming directly off of the what? What's it coming off of? The aorta, right? And so we have blood going this way, and then the renal vein is delivering blood into the what?
Inferior vena cava.
Inferior vena cava. That's right. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this screen. All right. And we're going to talk about that blood flow. So we're going to start with the aorta.
Is there anything about the adrenal gland we need to know?
No, we're just gonna, we'll talk about it a little bit as far as hormones a little bit later in our lecture, but for right now, just covering the kidney. All right. So the aorta delivers blood into the renal arteries, right? And from renal arteries, we go to smaller arteries. And we're gonna say that these are in our book and our PowerPoint. So we're gonna look at those in just a minute. From the smaller arteries, we're gonna lead to arterioles, all right? And these are branches. I wanna say like branches of small arteries, all right? So eventually we get to arterioles, and then from arterioles to capillaries, and then from capillaries to venules, to branches of veins. All right. Again, we're going to take a look at these in our book and our PowerPoint. All right. And then from the branches of veins, we're going to see the renal vein, and then back to the IVC. All right. So, and we know the heart's in, the blood leaves the heart through the aorta and blood enters through the IVC. So there's something very unique about this blood flow. It should look really familiar to you to this point because we've done it a couple times. The very unique thing about this is that when we get to this point here, all right, blood goes through arterial capillaries, back to arterioles, and then back to capillaries. So we go through this route 2 times. So what we see, the first arteriole is called the afferent arteriole, and the second one is called the efferent arteriole. So this is the first one, and this is the second one. All right. So for the capillaries, the first capillary that we're going to see is called the glomerulus. And the second set of capillaries is called the peritubular capillaries. All right. So what happens here is blood enters from these smaller arteries into the afferent arteriole, to the glomerulus, to the efferent arteriole, and then into the peritubular capillaries. So this is blood flow. So this is our second flow that we need to, this is blood flow, all right, to the kidney and the nephron. Have this written down.
So this is blood flow to the nephron?
So it's blood flow to the kidney and the nephron. So blood flow, it goes to the kidney and to the nephrons of the kidney. And remember, the nephrons are the functional units of the kidney. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase this. All right, is everybody ready?
I'm good.
Chris,
I'm good.
everybody ready? Okay, all right. So the very next thing that we want to talk about is the nephron. All right, that blood flow. And there are approximately 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So there are approximately 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So the nephron receives blood, and remember, the nephron is separate from the blood, but we're going to see interaction through transport. So what that transport is going to look like is that 3-step process that we talked about: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So this is how urine is made. So the very first part of the nephron, when we talk about it, we have to talk about the blood flow. So here we see this afferent arteriole. All right. And the afferent arteriole leads into the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is a bundle of capillaries. And remember what I said, with every unit, we're going to go looking for those capillaries. So then what happens is, once blood flows through the nephron or through the glomerulus here, it's going to flow out through the efferent arteriole. All right. And this is all blood flow. This was within our blood. Capillaries and arterioles are part of blood vessels. But what surrounds this here is, we see that we have a structure that surrounds this first bed of capillaries, which we referred to as the glomerulus. All right. So this structure, this here, I said that backwards, sorry. This structure was known as the glomerulus. All right. And this structure is the first part of the nephron, known as the Bowman's capsule. All right. And what's going to happen here, the membrane transport between the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, is our first step, is filtration. All right. So substances are going to be filtered out. This is the only place in the body that filtration occurs. All right. So when we think about filtration, we want to know what is filtered. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. When we go on here, what we see is we see this next part of the nephron, all right? And this next part is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Let me just draw this out here. All right, so this part here, this is the proximal convoluted tubule. So let me write this over here. Convoluted tubule. All right, so that's the PCT. So when we look at the proximal convoluted tubule, we realize that this is a tubule connected to the Brodmann's capsule. So it's closest to the point of attachment, hence the proximal, all right? And what this filtrate is going to do is it's going to start to flow into this area. So we really want to understand what was filtered, all right? So filtered was glucose. I'm going to write this on the bottom so everybody can see my screen. Small proteins. We have sodium, potassium, chloride. We have bicarbonate filtered, urea, creatinine, and other waste such as toxins and things like that. We also see water. So we see all these substances are filtered out right there at the glomerulus. And these are just a few. So when we think about this and we look at this list that I've created, what we see is we don't want all of those things to end up here in the collecting duct, which produces the urine. So we don't want those things to end up here, especially glucose. So what happens here is that when we look at this here, remember, blood flowed in through the afferent arteriole. It was filtered at the glomerulus, and then it left through the efferent arteriole. Well, this efferent arteriole leads into this next set of capillaries, which we call the peritubular capillaries. And what happens there is that these peritubular capillaries surround the nephron. All right. So the other parts of the nephron that we have here is we have the descending limb, and it's the descending limb of the loop of Henle. All right. So let's write that up here. LOH is referred to as the loop of Henle. All right. I've got to put you on pause here for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So what happens next is we see the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. All right, so this is the ascending limb. So this loop flows downward and then it flows upward. Here we see that at the end here we have the distal tubule. And then we already know this is the collecting duct. So these peritubular capillaries surround this tubule. And what happens is that when we have filtration, remember we had things that were filtered out that we necessarily don't want to end up here. So the next step is reabsorption. And what happens here is substances are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. All right. So we see that happening throughout. We see substances being reabsorbed back into these peritubular capillaries. Right. So we're going to talk about all of this, what is reabsorbed and where, and how this all works. All right. So the very next step that we see within this nephron is we also see secretion. So sometimes substances that are not filtered are secreted into the blood, but we also see hormones. So if we can identify this here, the red arrows indicating reabsorption and the blue arrows indicating secretion. So things like ADH and aldosterone may be secreted.
Circle secretion with blue.
I'm sorry?
Circle your word secretion on the left-hand side in blue.
Okay, there you go. Yep. All right, so we have this three-step process happening within these nephrons. And think about this. This is the scale that we're thinking about. There's approximately 1 million in each nephron. All right. So I have a little video that I'm going to show you on this as well. But before I do that, I want to go back and I just want to talk about this here. So when you're thinking about this, I want you to think about, let's just put this into kind of a perspective, an easier perspective. You're traveling, you're traveling on a bus and you're on a trip. Everybody's eating and drinking and, there's lots of trash. So the bus driver decides to pull over and clean the bus out. And he tells everybody to get off. He says, all the people, let's just clean this bus out. So he goes in and he gets rid of all the trash, right? And, some things have to stay on the bus, like, the steering wheel and that kind of stuff. So when we think about that, we're cleaning out everything. So even the people had to get off the bus. So what happens here is that, then we have to put the people back on the bus. So they're reabsorbed. So you want to think about that as, as this just kind of as a little example. I don't know whether it's a good example or not, but, as you're putting stuff back into the blood that you necessarily had to take out to clean the blood here. All right. So we need a very high pressure here in order for this filtration to occur. And that pressure is called hydrostatic pressure. All right, hydro meaning water. So it's important that our water balance is intact so that filtration, reabsorption, and secretion can occur. All right. All right, so let's go on and I'm going to go ahead and clear this and let's watch it.
Stand by.
I'm sorry?
Stand by, please, before you clear it.
Okay. Say that one more time.
Just stand by before you clear it.
Okay. Just let me know when.
Okay, got it.
All righty. All right, so clearing now. All right, and let's go back to our section here. Okay. And I need to do a new share. Here, right? All right. And this is our nephron.
Hi, in this tutorial, I'm going to talk about the function of the nephron. In the renal anatomy series, we looked at the structure of the nephron. In order to get the most out of this video, I suggest that you make sure you've watched the renal anatomy series. If you haven't, you can check it out at handwrittentutorials.com. So I'll begin by drawing a nephron. And this nephron is a little less than anatomically correct. But when we talk about the physiology of the nephron, it's easiest to draw it out like this. So the blood enters the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole here and exits via the efferent arteriole here. As the blood flows through here and then onto the vasa recta and the peritubular capillaries, elements of the blood get pulled into and out of this system of tubes. Filtration is the major way in which stuff gets out of the blood and into the nephron. Then, as this filtrate moves along the nephron, stuff can get added to it or removed from it. In general, more stuff gets removed from it than added to it. So I'll just label these arrows. F is for filtration, R is for reabsorption, which is the movement of stuff back into the blood. S is for secretion, which is the movement of stuff from the blood into the nephron. And E is for excretion, which is the urine on its way to the bladder. Let's begin by talking about filtration. The filtrate contains a lot of stuff, so I'm just going to talk about the most important ones. In general, the filtrate should not contain any large proteins, like albumin, or any red blood cells. The presence of these suggests a disease process, often within the glomerulus. Normal filtrate contains mainly water, and within that water are many different solutes. Sodium and chloride usually move together, so in this video, I consider them as one rather than listing them individually. There is also potassium and bicarbonate, glucose, amino acids, creatinine, and urea. Creatinine and urea are waste products, and one of the main purposes of urine production is to remove products like these from the circulation before they build up and become toxic. If everything is working okay with your kidneys, then you produce filtrate at about 90 mils per minute per 1.73 meters squared of body surface area. Note that this is not the same as producing urine, because most of the water will get reabsorbed so you don't dehydrate. Now let's look at what happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. Here we get reabsorption of potassium, sodium chloride, water, amino acids, glucose, and bicarbonate. And it's important to note that here, 65% of the sodium chloride and 65% of the water that was filtered is reabsorbed. Furthermore, about 100% of the amino acids and glucose that were filtered are reabsorbed because these are important nutrients for the body and it would be wasteful to excrete them. And also 90% of the bicarbonate gets reabsorbed. Excreting too much bicarbonate would cause you to become very acidotic and therefore very ill. Secreted in the proximal tubule are uric acid, which is another nitrogenous waste product, and also organic acids, which include many antibiotics. This is the way in which they are removed from the body. Now, the loop of Henle is all about concentration of urine. It does this by reabsorbing water in the descending limb, which is highly water permeable, and then reabsorbing 25% of the filtered sodium chloride in the ascending limb. This means that what we are left with is a higher concentration of waste products such as urea. In the distal convoluted tubule, we reabsorb about 5% of the filtered sodium chloride and some water. So you can see that the main way the nephron reabsorbs water is by movement of sodium chloride, which the water follows due to the osmotic gradient. In the distal tubule, some potassium and some hydrogen ions are secreted. This means moved back into the nephron. So a simple way to think about the nephron is that the proximal tubule does most of the reabsorption and secretion. The loop of Henle does the concentration, and the distal tubule does the fine tuning. This brings us to the collecting duct. And here, one last bit of reabsorption occurs. Some urea, about 5% of the filtered sodium chloride, and some water are reabsorbed. And this leaves us with excretion. The components of excretion are mainly water, sodium chloride, potassium bicarbonate, creatinine, and urea. And note that creatinine is not reabsorbed or secreted along the nephron. This is why it is used as a marker of the glomerular filtration rate. For example, if the level of creatinine in your blood begins to rise, it may suggest there is a problem with filtration in the glomerulus.
Okay, so real quick, when you look at this screen, you're seeing the substances that are reabsorbed, the substances that are secreted, as well as the substances that are filtered. So when you're thinking about this, we see, just as we said, much of this that is filtered out is going to be reabsorbed. So if you look at the glucose here, we have 100% of the glucose should be absorbed, meaning that we do not want glucose in our urine. But here, what we see is that at the end,
last thing I would like to mention.
Look at this here. We see that we have creatinine. Creatinine was filtered and it was neither reabsorbed or secreted throughout the nephron. So what we have is we have tests like creatinine clearance test, because we want to clear the creatinine in our blood. So that becomes markers for kidney disease if we are not clearing it all. That comes from muscle metabolism. So a little bit more on this. When we look at this bottom number, it says 90 mLs per minute. So this is what we call the glomerular filtration rate. All right, just a few points. So this is the glomerular filtration rate. Is there any questions? Anyone? Any questions? No?
I can't really see 173. Do we need to know that?
Say that again.
Let me make my screen bigger. Oh, I'm trying to make your screen bigger.
Oh,
At the bottom where it says 90 ml per minute, what's beside it? I can't really see it.
so we'll talk more.
1.73. Okay.
Yeah,
And
so
that was the glomerulus, what per minute?
that's the glomerular filtration rate, and we refer to that as the GFR. So
Okay.
what is filtered out. All right. So, we think about these units and we think about how much we rely on these processes and how these processes occur between tiny little capillaries in the kidneys and the tiny little nephrons that they are associated with. So let's go ahead, and now what I want to do is I want to go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so take a look here. All right. And when we look at this now, what we are looking at is we're looking at the kidney. So we've drawn this out. We realize that this indented area is the hilum, the kidney bean-shaped organ. We have the entrance for the renal artery, the exit for the renal vein. We see the ureter. We're going to later see some nerves and some lymphatic tissue in there. So we see that it's all entering within this point here. Sitting above the kidney, now this is not, this is not as what it would look like live. This is a cadaver view, but it is showing the adrenal gland, which is sitting upon the kidney. So we said that we have external layers and we have these internal layers. So the external layer, we're going to see fascia. So this is going to anchor the kidney to other structures. We know that the kidney sits in fat, so adipose tissue, an adipose capsule, all right? So remember what that looked like. This is a great representation of how this fat is working for the kidney. So it's situated within those layers, right? So then we see the renal capsule, which is a continuous layer around the kidney, all right? So we'll look at that in this next slide here. So here's this renal capsule, just a very thin layer around the outside of the kidney. As we work our way in from the renal capsule, we see the cortex, right? We see the renal pyramids. We see the papilla here, the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis here flows into the ureter. So notice that you have, fat situated in and around these spaces. And within these spaces here, these are pockets that are going to be called the renal sinuses. All right. So we want to add those in. This is our flow over here. So we see that we go from the collecting ducts here and we flow through the medullary pyramids. So I want to write that in there. Right. So let me go ahead and make sure that we put that in there. So before we get to the collecting, the end of the collecting duct there, we see that we have the renal pyramid there, right here. Oh, there goes my pen. If you guys can write that in you have it already in your notes, just make a note there. Not sure what's happening with my pen. One more. Oh, there it goes. All right, so just make that point, that medullary pyramid there. All right, to the papillary duct. So this is the papilla, the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, and then on to the ureter, to the urinary bladder. All right. So we added a few extra things in here. So we added on the capsule. So we have the renal capsule here. So we want to know that that exists. So that's here. All right. And we also added in the sinuses, right, which are these pockets here. So these are the renal sinuses. Remember that the papilla, it sits right underneath the pyramid because the purpose is really for urine to flow through from the collecting duct through the pyramid into the papilla here, and then into the minor calyx. So when we're thinking about this over here, this part here, this would be the sinus. All right. Okay. So go ahead and clear this. And I want you to take a minute and I just want you to observe this blood flow. And when you look at this here, you're going to look at, the very beginning. So we want to add those in. So here we have the aorta up here, which flows into the renal artery, and then the renal vein flows into the inferior vena cava. So go ahead and look at these four, these vessels here and these here. So these are our branches that we have, right? So these are the branches that we talked about. And I want you to locate them over here, right? And then we have the branches for the veins here. Right. So if you would go ahead and write those down in your notes, and I'll just give you 1 minute for that. All right. Does anybody have any questions? So let's go ahead and look at this. So how this works is we have this renal artery, then we have the segmental artery. You can see the segmental artery is branching out here, and it's branching out into the next one. So from the segmental artery, we went to the interlobal arteries, and then we're going to branch out eventually here. So we have these interlobal arteries and then the arcuate arteries. And what it's going to eventually do is it's going to eventually branch into this part here, and this is the part that surrounds the nephron. So when we look at this, we see that all of this is interacting with the nephron. All right, so blood and nephron interact. And you want to be clear that there's two separate parts. This is blood flow. So the next one that we look at is going to be nephron flow. So remember we said there would be three. Okay. So leading on to the next one here, all right. We have a name for, even though they're two separate systems, we have a name for the nephron and the glomerulus together. So let's think about that. Second, let me get my red. So here's your afferent arteriole, right? It goes into the glomerulus, and blood is filtered, and then it leaves through the efferent arteriole. When we look at this here, we see that the glomerulus, because remember, just put a big G in there, the glomerulus is going to interact, we have filtration, with the Bowman's capsule. So what we do is,
Now, I have a question. Now, when that blood comes out, is it pretty much clean of everything?
yes, it's filtered. So that's a very good question. So we'll talk about that in just a second. All right. So this part here is the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsules, massive capillaries. So what this is this is called the renal corpuscle. All right. So the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule equals the renal corpuscle. All right, so those two together. All right, so from that point, we want to realize what this is saying here. So the glomerulus, the glomerular Bowman's capsule has a visceral layer which wrap around the capillaries. So when we look at that here, we're going there, Randy, in just a minute. Let me draw this back out. All right. And what we see is we're going to see that it has to be very porous, but we see the visceral layer here, and we see the parietal layer here. All right. So we have a visceral and a parietal layer to the Bowman's capsule. All right. So the visceral layer, and it's got podocytes here. All right. So it wraps around the capillaries. The filtrate is collected between the visceral and the parietal layer. All right. And it is always called the filtrate from this point on. Whatever's left in the tubule is called the tubular filtrate. All right. So, the tubular filtrate eventually will become urine. Okay. So this is a better view of what this actually looks like. So we're looking at the renal corpuscle here, which includes the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So when we look at it at an external view, we would see something like this. We know that it's completely covered and that it would be the glomerulus inside. So when we're looking at this, we want to move on. So the glomerular cells have large pores and they are leaky. All right. So we have the basal lamina. It lies between the endothelium and the podocytes. The podocytes form pedicels between which are filtration slits. So this is how this works. And so the substances are leaving the blood and being filtered out in this way, right? So they're being filtered out through these areas. And then that filtrate collects between the visceral and the parietal layer. All right. So what is not filtered? So that was a good question. So when we look at this here, we want to consider what is not filtered. Oops, I didn't mean to click that. My pen. All right, so not filtered. So just like your video said, blood cells, all right, are not filtered. So red blood cells, white blood cells, all right. So when we look at this, and we have some water that stays behind, we also see that large proteins are not filtered, right? So there's a few substances that are not filtered out in this way. Okay, so two kinds of nephrons. We have the cortical nephrons located in the cortex, and then what we have is the juxtamedullary nephrons, which are located in the cortex, but they dip down a little bit further. All right. So when we're looking at this cortical nephron, this being the cortex, so let's just go ahead and think about the area that we're talking about here. All right, so we're thinking about the cortex of the kidney. All right, so this being the cortex. All right, and what happens is some nephrons are located well up here, and then some are on the border there of the medulla. All right, so we see that we have these two types. Either way, that loop of Henle there, this loop of Henle and the collecting duct, they loop down into the pyramid like this. All right, so some loop a little bit, the loop is not as deep as it is in the juxtamedullary nephron. So this is the loop of Henle. All right, so it's not always as deep in the other type of nephron. So let's go ahead and look at that real quick. So we can see in this nephron here, you see this loop it's nicely surrounded by these capillaries, but that it's going to run a little bit lower here in the cortex, and it's going to flow through a little bit deeper. And there's reason for that, because what happens is that these pyramids become very salty, and that helps to move water. So we're going to talk a lot about in the physiology of this is how, how salts are first reabsorbed, and then the water is going to follow those salts. So when we see this, we see that that is affecting the areas where the salt and the water are flowing into.
And this picture is the rule. There's the capsules are always in the cortex.
Yes. So the renal corpuscles are in the cortex. Some a little higher, some a little lower. Okay. So with the juxtaglomerular cells, we also see that we have a juxtaglomerular apparatus. So before we go any further, we really want to go back to the drawing board here for a second and think about what we're talking about in this picture. So we draw the nephron this way to learn the parts of the nephron. And as you saw in your video or heard in your video, you heard that it wasn't necessarily anatomically correct, right? So let's go ahead and draw this out. So we see that the nephron, what it actually does is it, we have the Bowman's capsule here, and we actually see it looping like this. All right, so because this is closest to the point of attachment, this is still the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, and then what it does is it loops down like this. All right, and we have these parts. So what I want you to do is I want you to try to go ahead and draw this, and then I want you to label it yourself. So see if we can label this correctly, and it's going the opposite direction there. Doing so far. So let's go ahead and let's, we said this was the Bowman's capsule. This is the proximal tubule. So what would this be here?
Descending.
That's the descending limb. And this is, remember, the loop of Henle, which makes this the what?
Ascending.
The ascending limb. And this is the what is this? This is the distal.
Distal convoluted tubule.
All right. So this here, we're going to say this is the afferent arterial and this is the efferent arterial. And it can go either way as long as it goes in, as long as they're going in the direction that they should. All right. All right. So when we're looking at this here, what we're seeing is we're seeing a connection between what is going in and what is leaving. So we're going to have some interaction here. And the reason why this is anatomically correct is because there is specialized cells located right here. And they detect what's going in so that the fine tuning can occur towards the end. So what I mean by that is here we have what we call, it's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And we call it the JGA, so the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And what it does is it's going to take us back to, it causes the release of renin. So remember, I'm going to just leave you with this, all right? So what happens when you have low pressure? Excuse me. And that low pressure was, excuse me, the low pressure set off that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. I am very sorry about my dog today. She is beside herself for some reason. I am unable to put her in her crate because she has gone to the bathroom in her crate. So
Sounds like she's having a good time.
I'm so sorry. So what happens here is that I'm just going to let her out. Hold on. Let her.
So does anybody know what is that AA up there?
That is the afferent arterial. There. And this is the efferent. So what we're looking at is we're looking at a connection between what is going in and what is leaving. So blood that is going into the glomerulus, and then what is leaving the filtrate. Because remember, this is all still filtrate. What's left over? So we get a lot of fine tuning in these areas because we don't want too much water to leave. So we see this, this JGA. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the physiology, and we'll understand a little bit more of where that is actually happening. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and clear this, and I'm going to take you back to your PowerPoint here. So do a new share.